There we are. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon to those on the East Coast. I'm Jane Harmon, President and CEO of the Wilson Center. And by the way, good afternoon or good morning to those on the West Coast, or good whatever to those wherever out there in the cloud. We're delighted you're joining us for the launch of a groundbreaking new report about gender and disinformation. This report covers material I was insufficiently aware of. Its title is Malign Creativity, words I had never heard put together. You'll learn more in a minute if you don't know all about this. But malign creativity means the use of coded language, iterative, context-based visual and textual memes, got that? And other tactics to avoid detection on social media platforms and spread targeted, gendered, and sexualized information. It's a mouthful, and it's real. And if you didn't understand it as I didn't, you better learn up, as I am, by watching this program. The good news is, here is good news, that women are making big strides. Avril Haines will serve as the first woman director of national intelligence, long overdue. Janet Yellen will be the first woman to head the US Department of Treasury, and groundbreaking, Kamala Harris has become the country's first vice president who happens to be a woman. I'm the first president and CEO of the Wilson Center who happens to be a woman, and as someone who was elected to Congress in 1992, the first so-called Year of the Woman, I know the power of example. But this report makes clear that as women, we are more likely to be targeted online with offensive, unfounded attacks about appearance, personal life, and fitness for office than our male counterparts. The internet has made these attacks much worse. Surely they happened pre-internet when I was first in office, but they happen at a speed and with a velocity that I did not know about then. The report is a wide-ranging landmark study encompassing 6 social media platforms, 2 months of observation, and over 330,000, get this, data points, and confirms not only that this form of online abuse against women continues, but that it is incredibly widespread. It's not just the quantity of these attacks, it's that they are getting worse. Today, disinformation tactics are being trained on women to reduce our credibility and discourage our participation in public life. Participants in the study explained how they disengage from their public-facing work when they are targeted, and their reports of abuse to platform safety teams go unheard. This has consequences for the aspiration of women and girls, obviously, who are weighing whether to go into politics or careers that involve a public presence. It's also a national security issue. As I have said for decades, women are more than 50% of the population. That makes us, as far as I'm concerned, more than 50% of the talent pool. How do you field a capable government if more than 50% of the talent pool has disincentives to participate? And while social media companies have become increasingly aware of these issues, much more needs to be done to make their platforms a place where women, especially women of color, can freely express their opinions without the fear of gendered or sexualized attacks. Lawmakers, too, need to set an example so these sorts of attacks are no longer acceptable. We know this report will be the beginning of an in-depth conversation in Washington and beyond about these issues, and we trust it will lead to change that makes the internet a more equitable place for women's voices, and I trust it will lead to more women and girls being excited about public service, as I was and still am. To tell you more, much more, and to tell me more, much more, is the vaunted Nina Jankowicz, the lead researcher and our Science and Technology Innovation Program's Disinformation Fellow. I've always loved that title. She's full of information and full of information about disinformation. But at any rate, Nina is one of the gems in the Wilson Center crown. She's been part of our family since 2017, first at the Kennan Institute, and now with STIP. And her research on foreign and domestic disinformation has improved our understanding of these issues in Washington and beyond. She has testified multiple times before Congress, regularly appears on TV, radio, and in print. And her book, How to Lose the Information War, Russia, Fake News, and the Future of Conflict, published last year, was a seminal text for any policymaker or layman looking to learn how to beat disinformation. We're thrilled to host Nina's actionable, important piece of research, produced in collaboration with Moonshot CVE, a London-based social enterprise specializing in countering violent extremism and other online harms. Now, buckle up, I certainly am, and learn, if you didn't already know, about malign creativity. Over to you, Nina.
Thank you so much, Jane, for that wonderful introduction. And I just want to say how grateful we are to you, to Meg King, to the entire STIP program for giving this research a home. And in particular, we're grateful to you for your leadership, not only in Congress, but as the first woman to lead the Wilson Center. So thank you. We'll move to the next slide, please. And before we begin, I just want to let everybody know we will have time for some questions at the end of the presentation. So if you have a question, you can submit it via Twitter @WilsonStip or via email at stip@wilsoncenter.org. Please do include your name and affiliation. And finally, a warning to our viewers, this presentation does include offensive language. We thought this was important, not to censor the language with which women are targeted, and make sure that we're authentically representing the severity of this problem. Next slide. I started thinking about the intersection of gender and disinformation when I was researching my book. I kept coming across examples of women in public life, either members of parliament, journalists, activists, who were being targeted by Kremlin-sponsored disinformation. I wrote about this in a piece in 2017 for Coda Story. They're a regional outlet based in the Republic of Georgia. And I described disinformation campaigns against a Ukrainian member of parliament and a Georgian journalist who were targeted with a faked nude picture and fake sex tapes. And in both cases, in these highly patriarchal traditional societies, this was meant to undermine both their credibility and that of the democratic movements that they represented. I called these campaigns sexualized disinformation. And The Economist explored this term in 2019, and several other researchers also began to explore it. Next slide. And with a growing interest in this topic, we decided to embark on a project to define and quantify and evaluate the use of online gendered abuse and disinformation against women in public life. And as we at the Wilson Center, as Jane just explained, are focused on putting forward actionable ideas based on our research. Of course, this report is replete with recommendations for policymakers in the tech space, in legislatures, and also in organizations that might have women attached to them that are in public life facing some of this abuse. As Jane mentioned, we completed this project in concert with Moonshot CVE, which is a London-based social enterprise, again, focusing on identifying and countering various online harms. And I'm very pleased to introduce two of my brilliant co-authors, Jillian Hunchak and Alexandra Pavliuk. Jillian is a research analyst who specializes in far-right extremism in French and English language contexts. She currently carries out research at Moonshot CVE as well as Insight Threat Intelligence. She holds an MA from King's College London in Terrorism, Security, and Society. And Alexandra Pavliuk is a dear friend of mine and one of the most brilliant minds in social network analysis. She's currently a PhD student at the Oxford Internet Institute, one of the premier places to study disinformation in the world. And she has done some fascinating network research for us and published at a number of places, including the Defense Strategic Communications Journal, as well as CBC News in Canada. So I'm going to turn it over to Jillian and Alexa now.
Thank you so much, Nina. I will just get you to go to the next slide, please. Ooh, that's not quite the right one, but that's okay. We can carry on. So as Nina explained or mentioned, it was important for us to distinguish between generalized gendered abuse and targeted disinformation. So it was mentioned that we collected over 330,000 pieces of data. And once we had collected these, we separated them into those two categories. We found that, first of all, gendered abuse is much more prevalent than disinformation. Keywords directly related to gendered abuse accounted for about 50% of our total data set. And by contrast, keywords related to gendered disinformation accounted for only about 7.5% of our total data. So this was a big gap between the two, and it suggests to us that abusers online generally use abusive language much more frequently than they spread disinformation or talk about disinformation narratives. However, what's interesting is we also found that 9 of our subjects were targeted with disinformation compared to 12 out of 13 of our subjects having been targeted with general abuse. So these numbers actually aren't too different, 12 versus 9. And this suggests to us that while internet users might more frequently use abusive language in practice, there is also a subset of users who create or spread disinformation at quite a similar rate. I just wanted to check with Nina that we are going through the right slides right now. Sorry, Nina. Are we doing okay?
I think so. Yeah,
okay.
I'm not sure. Just tell Zoe when you want to go forward.
No, fair enough. Zoe, could you hop to slide 11, please? Perfect. Thank you. Right. So as I was saying, these narratives, these disinformation narratives might not be spread quite as widely as regular abuse, but they certainly exist and target nearly as many subjects. So I'll just get you to hop to the next slide, please. So even though the relative percentage of disinformation found was quite low, this doesn't mean that it was insignificant or not nearly as harmful towards its targets. Of the disinformation narratives that our team identified, we found 3 themes of narratives that affected multiple subjects. So these were sexual disinformation narratives, transphobic disinformation narratives, and racist or racialized narratives. So sexual narratives were by far the most common overall. These accounted for 5% of our total data collected, while transphobic and racist or racialized narratives accounted for 1.6% and 0.8% respectively. Additionally, disinformation narratives overwhelmingly targeted Kamala Harris. 78% of all of our disinformation data collected was directed specifically at her. And while Kamala Harris was the main target of most of these narratives, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was also targeted in each category, excuse me. So we'll just go through each of these narratives now. Next slide, please. So sexual disinformation narratives were typically aimed at spreading a rumor of a sexual scandal or explaining a supposed explicit sexual past that would morally discredit the subject and call into question their suitability for politics and public life. So for instance, one of the narratives that we identified was that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had made a sex tape several years ago. And proponents of this narrative have created photoshopped images or stills of this alleged sex tape in order to prove its existence. This graphic here shows some of the most common keywords related to sexual disinformation narratives. We can see that many of them are related to Kamala Harris, as mentioned before, and most of these are in reference to the disinformation narrative that she, quote unquote, slept her way to the top and is sort of promiscuous for the sake of her career. So narratives like these ultimately target the subject's political qualifications, their ability to do their jobs, and ultimately just aim to distract from their political work and focus attention on very sexist ideas of what sorts of activities women engage in, especially to advance their careers. Equally interesting, though, were the subjects that were not targeted with sexualized disinformation. We found that generally, with the exception of Kamala Harris, subjects that were around middle age or older tended not to be hypersexualized, and these narratives typically focused on some of our younger subjects. However, one exception to this rule was Ilhan Omar. She was overwhelmingly targeted with racist abuse and disinformation, and not so much sexualized or, had some of those stories thrown at her. We found that most subjects were hit with multiple angles of abuse, especially if they presented intersectional identities. And Ilhan Omar, as a Black, visibly Muslim woman, we would expect to see multiple types of disinformation and abuse leveled against her, but didn't. So our hypothesis for her exclusion from these narratives is that abusers preferred to categorize her as a foreign threat, and therefore not someone with which they could identify or see as desirable. And we'll talk more about Omar in the racist narrative section. So transphobic disinformation narratives. These ones targeted Kamala Harris, Gretchen Whitmer, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and Jacinda Ardern. And in all of these cases, the narrative was the same, which is that these women are secretly transgender and therefore, by extension, cannot be trusted. This is an exceptionally discriminatory narrative because it implies two things. The first is that transgender people are inherently deceptive and that they have a responsibility to disclose their gender identities, especially in public-facing roles. Neither of these things are true, of course. And the second implication is that women cannot ascend in status without some amount of trickery or even male energy that proponents of this narrative believe transgender women to have. So this narrative as a whole is both transphobic and misogynistic, and again attempts to distract from these subjects' political work and refocus their attention on their gender identities, with the assumption that being transgender is sort of an unacceptable, scandalous thing. Last slide, please. So finally, we identified racist and racialized disinformation narratives. These, again, primarily targeted Kamala Harris, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and Ilhan Omar. We found that after we collected our data, we needed to distinguish between racist and racialized narratives. So racist narratives are those which aim to degrade or harm a subject based on their ethnicity, whereas racialized narratives attempt to discredit a subject's ethnic identity or identities. We see the clearest example of racist narratives in those directed at Ilhan Omar. And there are so many that were directed at her, but among some of these narratives were the ideas that she's an illegal immigrant, that she's a terrorist, or that she's married to her biological brother. And all of these aim to put her in a frame of being a dangerous foreigner and separate her as much as possible from American values and norms. And the implication here is that she does not represent American values and norms, and therefore she cannot represent the American people. Now, by contrast, racialized narratives discredit the subject's ethnic identities. One of these was directed at Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, which argued that she was not the working class Latina that she claimed to be, but actually a wealthy, privileged, effectively Caucasian woman. And this narrative is represented here at the bottom by the keyword Sandy Cortez, which, as you can see, is the most recorded keyword within this category. And Sandy Cortez is a nickname that Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez allegedly used to use in college. And it's been weaponized against her to sort of strip her of her Latin name and bring to mind the image of a white privileged person. So these were the three main narratives that we identified in our data. And I'll hand it back to Nina or Alexa.
Yes, it's off to me now. Thank you so much, Jillian, for your outlining of our main narratives that we picked up on. And next slide, please. Great, thank you so much. So to explore the coordination between users and narratives, we visualize the main keywords from the disinformation narratives that we uncovered. Every red dot you see in this network visualization is a keyword from a disinformation narrative that a user posted to social media. And the most used keywords are labeled here. In the middle of the network, the green lines connect keywords from a false narrative that Harris slept her way to the top and is therefore unfit for office, one that Jillian just mentioned. And the pink lines in the periphery that kind of surround that green narrative, they connect users to other keywords they used that represent other sexualized, racist, racialized, or transphobic narratives. We see two things here. First, users who engage with one narrative tend to engage with others, such as the transphobic narrative that Kamala Harris is a man named Kamal Aroush, and that she isn't actually Black and should therefore not claim to represent Black people. Second, this again demonstrates the intersectionality of the attacks against Kamala Harris, and we also observed quite similar intersectionality, as has been mentioned, about Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez and Ilhan Omar. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the previous network encapsulated words across all 6 social media platforms, but this one here shows users posting to specific message boards on Reddit, which are called subreddits. The network is of a group of subreddits that people post sexual fantasies to. Every gray dot here is a user, and every red dot is a subreddit. We can see that a number of gray users cross-posted calls for sexual and often abusive fantasies about Ocasio-Cortez on multiple red, erotic, and roleplay subreddits. Some of these calls included users seeking political roleplays about conservative politicians or Trump supporters having rough sex with Ocasio-Cortez, as well as roleplays about liberals degrading Ivanka Trump. One user, who is the gray dot on the bottom left of the network, posted similar calls to 8 subreddits and went as far as fantasizing about Trump raping Ocasio-Cortez and having his aides film the rape to use as blackmail in the future. This content demonstrates the degree to which a young female politician can be sexualized and fetishized online, a trend which demeans her credibility as a serious politician. And next slide. So this final network takes quite a deep dive into one user, shown as the gray dot in the middle of the network, who posted to 2 alternative networks we studied called 4chan and 8kun. In this network, you can see that this individual posted racist and sexualized disinformation narratives about Ilhan Omar to 8 different boards, shown as the red dots surrounding the gray dot in the middle. Each of which of these boards can be understood kind of as a separate community on these platforms. These repetitive posting patterns were most prominent on the politically incorrect and Q research boards, which you can see have the big arrows pointing towards them. And just as a note, the Q research board is dedicated to research about the QAnon conspiracy theory. Similarly to what we see here with Ilhan Omar, we also observed users engaging in repetitive and abusive posting patterns in multiple networks which targeted Kamala Harris, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, and Gretchen Whitmer. What these networks show us is that these individuals are engaging in repetitive, abusive behavior, and platforms should be able to detect this behavior, just like we have, to see that it violates some of their spam and harassment policies, and that they need to take appropriate action. And with that, I'll throw it back to Nina.
Thanks so much, Alexa. Next slide, please. So in addition to exploring the quantitative side to this phenomenon, we also thought it was really important to actually speak to the women who have been targeted by gendered abuse and disinformation. In addition to conducting 2 focus groups filled with women who not only study this phenomenon, but have been subject to it themselves, we conducted in-depth interviews with 3 prominent journalists who have experienced state-sponsored gender-based abuse and disinformation. I don't have time to go through these fascinating case studies today, but they are in the report, which I suggest you check out. It is live on our website right now. But suffice it to say that actors like China, Iran, and Russia are using the same gender-based tropes and tactics that we've identified that are being used in the domestic discourse, effectively weaponizing our society's own endemic misogyny in order to discredit these women and their work. And as Jane pointed out in the introduction, this makes gender-based disinformation a national security issue, as well as one that affects women's political participation. And we can turn the slides off now. I'm going to go through some of the challenges that we identified for platforms, as well as many of the solutions that we think are critical to solving this problem. So as Jillian already outlined and Jane mentioned, malign creativity is the greatest challenge to identifying and taking action against gendered abuse and disinformation. And to give you a little bit more of an idea about what we mean when we say malign creativity, these are the ways that abusers get around detection on platforms. So often you'll see things like the word bitch spelled with an exclamation point instead of the letter I, or special spacing that again allows these people to avoid detection by automated detection algorithms. Another example of this that unfortunately I have received myself is a picture of an empty egg carton, which is sent to women like me in their 30s who don't yet have children to remind us that according to these abusers, our place is in the kitchen, not necessarily doing research like this out in public life. And an automated detection algorithm is not going to automatically identify an egg carton as something that is abusive, but that is the meaning behind it. So if this content makes its way to a moderator's desk, they may not have the context necessary to take action against it. And that's a huge problem. And we hope that platforms will start to get around this in a couple of ways, which I'll identify in a couple of minutes. But they also have an issue. Their second challenge is that their definitions of targeted harassment, which govern a lot of their policies surrounding gendered abuse and disinformation, are really not adequate. I'll quote from 2 of our focus group participants who were talking about the effects of dogpiling, which is when a high follower user tacitly instructs their followers to criticize a target. Quote, "It was something very personalized, but not over the line harassment," end quote. Meaning that this original tweet that kind of sicked all of these users onto a target wasn't something that immediately said, please go attack Sarah. It was just kind of what we might call a dunk online. And this basically instructed all of these users to go and say horrible things to this user. But the originating piece of content wasn't taken down because it was not or did not meet the threshold of targeted harassment, even though that was its intent. The second quote is, quote, "It's coordinated in the sense that one target is chosen and that target is going to hell." Often, again, since there isn't that direct call to action, the content that inspired the onslaught of abuse is not removed. Only the most blatant offensive violations of platforms' terms of service are removed. The third challenge for platforms is that they lack intersectionality in enforcement. And I think one of our interviewees' quotes speaks for itself here. Quote, "I've had instances in which I reported disability-related harassment. And I know that the language is bad because I'm a disabled woman who faces this on a daily basis online. And I get the reply that they didn't find it violative of their harassment policies against a marginalized community. So for me, I'm like, do you have the right disability experts in place that are helping you understand the language and the nature of the campaigns and why this is actually harassment and not just a normal comment to make?" Again, the platforms don't necessarily have people who understand this important context, especially against marginalized communities and women of color. The fourth challenge is that the onus of reporting is on targets and detection for that matter. Rather than these multi-billion-dollar corporations detecting and identifying gender-based abuse and harassment, they rely on reports from women like us who are enduring it. One focus group participant said, "It is largely a content moderation problem that really puts the burden on the individual being attacked to report the harassment. And then they're in wait mode, and you don't know if you're going to get a response in 24 hours at maybe the best case scenario, or several days, or maybe there will be no action whatsoever. And one of our interviewees described the act of shielding oneself from abuse as exhausting, this blocking and reporting and muting that you need to do, all while essentially reliving this trauma that is being directed at you in order to get rid of the content. Related to that, the offline burden on targets is discounted. Many people really struggle to understand what these campaigns do to you. And having gone through them myself, I can tell you that they're exhausting, they're terrifying, and they change the way that I think about my engagement online. One of our interviewees said that these campaigns are obviously designed to push you down, and it has the effect of grinding away your resistance, your ability to get through something psychologically. So I almost see it as a type of psychological warfare technique. Think about that for a second, that someone, just for engaging in the work that she does online publicly to advance her career, to speak up about certain issues, is being targeted with psychological warfare in order to keep her out of the public discourse. There's also few consequences for abusers when this content is identified. They might have that content, the offending content, removed. They might have their account locked temporarily. In rare cases, they are deplatformed, but it's easy for the abusers to operate with near impunity by creating a secondary account, things like this. And now, one more challenge, sorry, I don't have my pages in order here. Finally, one more challenge that I think we've all identified a couple of times, and I just really want to drive home, is that women of color face far greater threats than their white counterparts, both in the number and level of the vitriol that white women receive online. These threats are not only sexual, they are often racist and usually violent in nature. One of our interviewees said that women of color deal with both the gender harassment perspective in addition to the racial aspects that come at us. And sometimes they're right on top of each other and layered on top of each other without people understanding what's happening. Another focus group participant brought up the idea that even the reporting structures that exist online in order to get violative content taken down are often weaponized against women of color. This is called brigading. Sometimes trolls will tell each other and organize to report a certain piece of content in order to get that content taken down or that account locked, particularly against women of color. And that is something that the platforms really need to think about, not only how these tools are protecting people, but how they can be turned on their heads in order to essentially weaponize them and attack those that they're meant to protect. Now I'm going to get into some of the recommendations here. There are many more in the report, but I'm just going to highlight the most important ones right now. The first, and I think the most important recommendation that we have, is that platforms introduce incident reporting rather than one-off reporting, which is what most of them operate on right now. Essentially, again, burdening the victim with the task of reporting individual pieces of content. So when you are getting dogpiled online and you have hundreds of tweets coming at you, sometimes per minute, or on other platforms where this is common, you have to go through and individually report those pieces of content. What we recommend instead is that platforms introduce these incident reports so that women can create more context, give a more holistic view to the platforms of what is going on, what might have triggered this behavior, where it started from, so that platforms, again, can interpret the content in the context that it is being sent to the user in, and perhaps stem it at its source. We also suggest that platforms regularly and proactively update their classifiers, so these keywords that govern their automatic detection systems, in order to root out malign creativity. As we were researching a lot of these narratives, we had to kind of learn a new lexicon ourselves, a new language of how these women were described by their abusers online. You better bet that the social media managers who were behind these women running political campaigns during the fall saw this stuff on a regular basis. And if there is more of a proactive communication from the platforms to the campaigns, not just relying on the campaigns or the individual women to report these tactics, I think that that would stem a lot of the abuse a bit more proactively. And right now it's just not happening. Again, the onus is on the victims. We also suggest that platforms create and enforce meaningful consequences for persistent abusers. They all have terms of service or community standards, which are very helpfully outlined in our report in an appendix if you're interested in the different policies that these platforms are putting forward. But right now they are just not being used. They are not being enforced to the extent that they need to. And so much of the abuse is falling through the cracks. Finally, we encourage platforms to introduce nudges or friction to stop abusive behavior. This is like a little bit of a speed bump that might remind you if you're about to post abusive content based on those keywords that we talked about before. They'd ask, hey, are you sure you want to do this? Sort of like what's been going on Twitter recently, where it asks you if you've read an article before you want to retweet it. This is a similar thing. Instagram has explored this for teens who are bullying each other online. I think that we should introduce it to really root out online misogyny as well. And platforms should also consider creating a cross-platform consortium to share data and root out malign creativity. Something like this already exists. It's called the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism, or GIFCT. And this is where platforms share hashes of images or videos that include terrorist content so that they can remove that content. We saw cross-platform campaigns in our research. Sharing those classifiers across the industry would help platforms stay ahead of malign creativity. We also have some recommendations for lawmakers, really important as we think about social media regulation, which I think we all know is coming down the pike very soon in the new Congress, that we include transparency reporting requirements for social media regulation bills. This would allow us better to understand the scope of the problem, how many reports platforms are getting, how many reports they are acting on, the amount of takedowns that they've done, what content they decided to leave up. All of this is really important for understanding the scope of the problem, but also understanding whether platforms are upholding their duty of care for half or over half of their user base in some cases. And then it will allow us to hold them accountable. It's also important that Congress lead by example, and this is, of course, is true for law-making bodies in other countries as well. I really hope that we see the introduction of more rules, as we've seen, related to deepfakes and campaigning materials and on the Congress floor, related to gendered and sexualized insults and disinformation, because we have been seeing these actually shared by members of Congress with increasing frequency. And just like we have rules against using personalities, as they call it, on the floor of Congress, I think this should also be prohibited, and we should expect a higher standard of behavior from our elected representatives. And most importantly, the Violence Against Women Act unfortunately lapsed in 2019. It was not renewed during the 2020 Congress. This act included many important provisions to protect women from physical threats and abuse. And I hope that when it is reauthorized, hopefully it will be in the new Congress, that it includes provisions for online abuse as well, because as we've laid out, this has implications not only for women's democratic participation, but for our national security. And it's key that we raise awareness about it and start to combat it. And then lastly, we do have recommendations for employers as well. So many jobs today are public facing. You need to be online promoting your work if you want anyone to read it, frankly. That's not just for journalists or academics, people in think tanks, but true for politicians and many other professions as well. And very few employers have policies about how they will support their employees in relation to online harassment that they undergo as a result of their work. So we encourage employers to think about how they might lend legal, psychological, moral, and monetary support for targets of abuse. They might pay, for example, for anti-doxing services if that's necessary, or they might escalate abuse with platforms and advocate for and build awareness of these campaigns. It's really critical. So before we close and take questions, I just want to really drill home the impact of what this abuse has. It's not just silly memes on the internet. In the short term, women are disengaging from public life. One of our focus group participants said, "Oftentimes, my solution is to lock down my account, or I go completely offline and I don't post for days. You don't feel safe to continue speaking, so you don't speak." I just think that that is It's saddening, it's frustrating, but it's the truth of what many women in public life endure on a daily basis online. And that's in the short term. In the long term, the prevalence and effectiveness of these narratives, which the infrastructure of social media encourages, this is a fissure that malign actors, malign foreign actors, can use to target us, to drive our society even further apart. It is a national security issue. And of course, yes, this has repercussions on women's participation in democracy, on our equal representation. Because if experts in their field and high-profile women are changing their behavior and engagement after online abuse and disinformation, let's think about what all the women who see that are doing and whether they're considering to engage at all. They might pull back from that engagement, and that is not something we should be striving for in 2021. Yes, this is a record-breaking year for women, but for all those women, their engagement in public life has come with a tacit cost. And we hope this paper will be the beginning of a conversation about how to make this, the internet and also the offline world, a safer and more equitable place for women's voices. So with that, I'll remind you that we can take your questions. We'll be looking at them now. And Jane, as is our tradition, we would love to throw the first question to you. I think Jane is off the line. So we will then, we'll go to our questions from the audience. This one is about deepfakes and cheap fakes. Throughout the 2020 election, we saw that cheap fakes, which are manipulated images and videos that have been easily cut or slowed, for example, were used to mislead the public. Should those be regulated in any way on the internet, and can they be without violating First Amendment rights? I am happy to answer that one. So as I mentioned in my remarks about Congress, there are some new rules and bills being introduced in order to regulate or at least stop the distribution of deepfakes and manipulated media in official congressional business. And there is also a Deepfakes Accountability Act that passed the House a year or two ago. I don't think it's made it through the Senate yet. But certainly, I think this is a topic that many members of Congress are concerned about, as they have been targeted by deepfakes and cheap fakes. And I think we do need to expand it to all manipulated media, because often what we see when we're looking at disinformation is really poorly manipulated or misattributed even images that are used to spread disinformation. And there is work in the tech field going on this. Adobe, which created the software that many of these images are created with, is doing some excellent work on that with Twitter and the New York Times, where they're really looking at labeling this content so that people have context for where it came from and how it's been edited. And I think that that is a more tenable solution in preservation of freedom of expression and First Amendment rights than taking that down. Jill and Alexa, don't know if you have anything to add?
The one thing I'll say is that we did observe, like one example of kind of a cheap fake we saw was around Kamala Harris, the transphobic narrative that she was a man named Kamala Rouche, as Jillian mentioned. So just want to underscore that there was one example at least that we picked up on.
As well as with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, which I mentioned, just the proposed or sex tape stills, which were very obviously fakes, but they were still, you know, spread around at quite a rapid rate.
Absolutely. So another question that I think both of you can speak to based on the network analysis and narrative analysis that you did. The question says, I think this is the first time that I've seen some attempt at methodologically parsing out the racial dimensions of gender-based attacks. How do you suggest to adjust social media research methods to better parse out attacks based on both? Alexa, do you want to take that one first?
Yeah, I think keep it at the forefront of the research questions you ask, right? We expected to see this, and we had it in mind, and we were you know, looking for it, like we were looking for other narratives. So bringing these types of intersectional questions to the forefront of the research that we're doing is really the first main step. And then, of course, learning around it, reading literature by people who study this or who are from those marginalized groups, also very important. Kind of broaden what you're reading so you learn from them and continue the research that's got more wisdom.
Jill, do you have anything to add there?
Yeah, I would say as well, just make sure that when you are undertaking this research, you have intersectional voices contributing to the types of questions that you ask. Our team, as wonderful as we are all white women. And so it was, there were some surprises when we did gather the data and look at it, such as the racializing narratives. I didn't expect to see people attacking women of color and attempting to actually strip away some of their identities. I expected those identities to be entirely weaponized against them. So that's something that we do have to keep in mind, is that, where we're coming from as researchers will totally impact how we actually approach these questions.
Absolutely. And just a little bit more on our sample, which we didn't want to bog down too much in the beginning of the presentation, but we did draw from 13 female politicians, both across party lines and representing a variety of ethnic and racial backgrounds, which we really thought was extraordinarily important for this research, because we expected to see some of these intersectional narratives a little bit, but the extent to which women of color were subjected to so much more vicious narratives, I think, was surprising to everyone. We also made sure in our focus groups and interviews to represent marginalized communities and women of color. And again, I think that's one of the most striking conclusions of our research, how not only are those social media platforms in particular not holding up their end of the bargain for half of their user base, but they are failing particularly hard when it comes to people with intersectional identities. I muted myself, but we have more questions. So there's one that I will happily answer about how nation states leverage gendered disinformation against the 3 interviewees. Did their tactics differ at all from typical users waging abuse? So these 3 women, Leta Hong Fincher, Yagane Razayan, and Nicole Perlroth, are all journalists. Nicole focuses on cybersecurity, but as a result of her beat, she has been reporting on Russia quite a bit for the last several years. Yagane Razayan is an Iranian national, married to Jason Razayan, the Washington Post bureau chief from Tehran, who was imprisoned for many years. And Leta Hong Fincher focuses on feminism in China. All 3 of these women were targeted with gendered tropes that meant to discredit their reporting. Sometimes these tropes were sexualized, and they all came from state-backed entities. So in Iran, it was the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, China state media, and Russian RT and Sputnik in particular, targeting Nicole Perlroth. And these it really fits in with how nation states, how foreign actors use disinformation in general. It's, again, really latching onto pre-existing fissures in our society, misogyny being one of them, and understanding that this content is going to do extraordinarily well, because there are still, unfortunately, many people in the world who are all too happy to engage in these narratives. So it might be something like presenting the interviewee in an unflattering picture, something as simple as that, or alleging things about their sexual past, or simply alleging that they are stupid. Again, attempting to attack that credibility. And does it differ from how normal users engage in this abuse? Well, we see kind of a lot of trolling among normal users, people who might dogpile, kind of dunk in once and then leave. But when it's coming from a state-based media entity, the follow-on effect from all of this is that the credibility of the target is kind of besmirched in the eyes of potentially millions of people, because many of these state-based media outlets have, millions of followers or millions of viewers. In the case of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, which created a documentary about Ms. Razayan. But they also are really creating a stain on that woman's public record for the rest of her life. And this actually, in the research that I did earlier that inspired this research, the Ukrainian MP that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, she had this fake nude image of her and posts on message boards about her running around naked on the streets of Kiev. Follow her beyond Ukraine. She went to an event at the United Nations and spoke about women's rights in Ukraine, and a reporter asked her whether those allegations were true. So they have an effect not only on the movements that the women represent, not only on our cohesion as a society, but on the women's reputations themselves. And I think in that way, they can be a lot more damaging than some of these other troll campaigns, which, while they are awful to deal with, it's not this long-term effect that some of these state-based media outlets can really push forward. Another example of this, which perhaps I'll explore a little bit in further research, is the new White House spokesperson, Jen Psaki, was targeted when she was the State Department spokesperson by RT, who again portrayed her as stupid and not fit for the job of spokesperson, using silly memes and things like that in order to discredit her based on these gender-based tropes. Great. There is a question about methodology. So I noticed several of the platforms you analyze don't have tailored algorithms as strong as TikTok or Instagram. How do you think that impacts the spread of these ideas on the sites you examined, as well as those you did not? Since the platforms rely on individuals creating their own safe spaces to promote these ideas, do you think it's easier to trace the spread through static subforums versus the more tailored explore pages? And what are some ways to combat that hurdle in the future? I will turn that over to my data gurus here. Jillian, do you want to take that one first?
I was actually just going to pass it to Alexa to see if she had a better answer, since she's much more familiar with networking.
It's a very good question. You've definitely given us all directions for future research. Yeah, the question of the kind of explore pages versus where these people may go to search on their own. It could depend on the different behaviors that people have on different platforms. Yeah, we did find it interesting that there are kind of, in general, subgroups, so boards or subreddits that people go to, and there may be slightly fewer posts, or you're actually able to curate it on your own to see what the most popular ones were that day, that week, or that month. So my half answer to it is that there are definitely ways people can self-curate on some of these platforms, and those different modes of curation can affect the information that people see online. And of course, we need to continue thinking about it and trying to understand it better and what it means for the spread of disinformation. This is broadly related to what I'd like to study for the next few years in my PhD, so I might have an answer in 3 to 4 years.
The one thing I would add there is that there certainly is a gap in our data. We were able to take data from platforms that have open APIs, so platforms like Twitter, some of the image boards, 8kun, 4chan, Gab, Reddit, a message board, and Parler. And where we didn't get data from is Facebook, and then TikTok, which has a kind of semi-open API, but that data is a lot harder to get at. And I think what the question is getting at is that people kind of exist in these, for lack of a better term, echo chambers. That's certainly true on TikTok. One of our interns, Shannon, discovered some of the same disinformation targeting Vice President Harris on TikTok, but the difference is you really have to go look for it if you're not already consuming that information. And so that means that in terms of detecting it, if we're relying on users to report that information and they're not seeing it in these extraordinarily tailored for you algorithms, then the platforms have a big hurdle to overcome in identifying that disinformation, because it exists. And this is one of the things that we talk about in more detail in the report that we didn't have time to get to today. It exists in less frequented places or less visible places, not just places where it's driven by the algorithm, but things like private groups on Facebook or messenger groups, encrypted groups, all these things. It makes it much more difficult to track. And it's absolutely, as Alexa said, something that I think we all as researchers need to to really spend time on, but also to pressure the platforms in opening up their data, because this is a matter of safety in many cases.
Could I add one thing to that, Nina?
Mm-hmm.
Just a topic that's sort of parallel to this is the concept of coordinated versus uncoordinated disinformation. And this was something that Alexa will know much more about since she tracks the actual networks. But something that might play into this is whether we actually see small groups of people who are coordinating and producing this disinformation and then spreading it out to be picked up by algorithms. So on platforms where we don't necessarily see very strong algorithms that might lead people towards these disinformation narratives, it could be a case of coordinated disinformation. One quick example here is back in the summer, Ilhan Omar was accused of engaging in a ballot harvesting scheme in Minnesota. And this entire narrative was created by Project Veritas, which is a right-wing news media outlet. And they coordinated with the former Trump campaign to sort of release this story and let it trickle out. And then the internet just took over from there. So it will depend on who is actually behind these narratives and who is coordinating their release and spread.
Definitely. Well, I think we don't really have time to get to some of the in-depth questions that you all have asked, but I'm sure we would love to engage on social media. So you can find us all on Twitter. And please do take a look at the report. It is available online. It is 60 pages worth of data and analysis, as well as some helpful appendices that can serve as reference points if you're wondering about platform policies and things of that nature. Thank you for your interest in this important topic. And again, we really hope this is the beginning of a conversation and a beginning of change for women and their engagement online and in public life more broadly. Thank you very much.